Hello fellow gamers and welcome back. I am as always Captain Sidarius.
And here's 7 Saturn.
Today I have the privilege to welcome Loren Osborn, one of the developers of Star Trek Away Team, the game which introduced me to the world of co-op gaming.
Hi, how's it going?
Very good.
Oh, just fine.
How about you?
Very good, thanks.
First let me thank you coming on to our show. Like I said, this game introduced me to the world of co-op gaming, and for me it was, of course as a Star Trek fan, always the better Commandos.
Reed, he always bugs people who are in the gaming industry. If a game lacks co-op, then he simply isn't happy. That's important to know.
Yeah, I thought co-op gameplay was kind of innovative for its time. I liked working on this game, and there's a lot of great thought that went into it.
And I have to say, sadly, it's still a rare thing. That's why I always mentioning. And I know you like it too, Saturn.
I certainly won't mind, no. In this specific case, I would like to know a little bit more about this co-op, but maybe let's go on.
I actually didn't really get the magic of co-op gaming until years later. A friend of mine introduced me to board games that were co-op. One ironically called Pandemic, and the other one called Horrors of Arkham, based on Lovecraft's writings.
You know, it's a funny thing. My first co-op board game was also Pandemic, and I really liked it a lot more than the usual competitive board games.
Yeah, that's true. And I also liked it very much more than the current Pandemic we are playing. So I would like to go back to the board game.
Amen.
Yeah, I wish there were less slots on that server.
But before we drift too far away from the main subject, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. The most important question for me is, of course, are you a Star Trek fan?
Yes, I am. Little intro on me. 46-year-old software engineer. Grew up and lived most of my life in Orange County, California. I went to school at RIT in Rochester, New York. I've got 3 kids and a wife. 1 boy and 2 girls, ages 2, 4, and 8. As far as Star Trek, yes, I'm a Star Trek fan. I grew up on TOS and to some extent Next Gen. Big fan of Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, Enterprise. A little behind on the movies. Definitely behind on most of the series. I'm clamoring to see Picard, but I haven't sprung for Paramount Plus yet. But Picard looks really great, and I want to see Lower Decks. I want to see Discovery, but Picard really looks tantalizing. And then I forget if it was 2 more series they had about to release. I know one of them was the Nickelodeon one.
Oh, there are currently in production. There are 2, Star Trek Prodigy.
Prodigy, yes.
And Star Trek Strange New World.
Strange New World, I haven't heard that much about, but Prodigy looks really interesting, especially with the age of my son and wanting to see him. He kind of gets a little glazed over seeing, dad's watching Star Trek again. Not that I do very often these days, unfortunately.
But this would have been my question. Are the kids watching the shows with you? Because if I look back, there are only a few shows that I actually do remember watching when I was very young, and Star Trek franchise is one of them.
I remember being introduced to Star Trek by my dad. We had a huge backyard when I was growing up in Anaheim. And my dad would have Star Trek on in the family room where he's outside mowing the lawn, and I'm watching Star Trek while he's mowing the lawn. That was my introduction to TOS.
It certainly beats the noise.
I don't know when he had a chance to watch it, but yeah. But yeah, my dad was a big Star Trek fan too. I don't think he's kept up so much with the series, but he was in aerospace a lot, so I think he really had an affinity from that too.
Yeah, it kind of goes along with each other.
Definitely.
And when did your passion for Star Trek basically lead you into the gaming industry?
I can't give Star Trek credit for that, unfortunately. I was an intern at FileNet, which is now part of IBM, and I heard about a new company that was trying to commercialize games for Linux, which wasn't target for commercial software yet. So they had a beta test program, and I was beta testing their first title, Civilization Call to Power. One thing led to another. I remember having breakfast with the CEO and CTO at what was then Baker Square, ironically near what's now my house. And then I was hired, and that was when I joined Loki Entertainment. We didn't actually create any new games. We were just a porting house, but that's how I got in the game industry. Then from there, eventually left Loki and joined Reflexive that did Away Team and several other titles that I had the privilege of working on.
So you have been doing this for quite some time now. As someone who knows how mixing up work and personal life can be problematic sometimes, do you actually play video games yourself, or do you think, well, I have enough of that at work, when I come home, I don't want to hear this anymore?
Yeah, I wish I had stayed in the video game industry. As much as I really loved what I did at Reflexive and I love the technology that we worked on, at the time that I left Reflexive, everything was 3D and I had zero 3D background. So at that time, there really wasn't any place for me at the video game developing studios that I applied to. So I actually branched off and I've been doing mostly web-centric stuff since then. So definitely web development. Other things I worked on cable set-top boxes. I worked on medication dispensing for a drug repackager, several other things. I'd love to get back into video games.
Kind of a mixed bag career, so to say.
Yeah, I would say it's been primarily web-based. And actually, my first web-based title was Ricochet at Reflexive, which was what I was working on after Zax, the title that I was hired for, and actually what was the genesis of Star Trek Away Team. I was working on Ricochet, and I actually did their online web-based purchasing system. It was so innovative at the time. If you don't leave the game, you just put in your credit card, and it sends something to the web server, and that was my introduction to MySQL.
And going back to your gaming life, do you have still one better?
I do like video games, although I tend to more align with construction video games, like Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 was a big one for me. Definitely SimCity, some Sims, but not as much. I played a lot of Little Big Planet, and I've actually introduced my son to that one. He actually likes that one.
That's nice, that's really nice. I wish my daughter would be old enough to experience the same feeling, but I will get there, I guess.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Switching a little bit to Star Trek Away Team, do you maybe know what the inspiration for the game was?
Kind of. So like I said, I was hired for a project called Zax. I was not hired at the beginning of Zax. I was actually hired when Star Trek Away Team was 2/3 done. So what happened was Reflexive was kind of a garage startup. They created an asteroids type game called Swarm, and they got some attention from Hasbro, and Hasbro commissioned a game from them. And this game was called Zax, which originally I believe was the name of the ship. And the character originally was a 6-foot grasshopper type character. Both of those changed, but it was basically a 2D isometric interactive shooter. And that was a game that they were in the process of doing. And then Hasbro closed up shop, and this miracle happened that somehow Hasbro reassigned all the intellectual property rights back to the developers, including Reflexive. So
that's awesome, actually. That's really awesome.
So Reflexive had a year or more of development that they put into this game, and they owned it, and it was not in any way a finished game, but it was something they could shop around to other studios, and they shopped it around, and Activision was interested, but they wanted to turn it into a Star Trek game. And that's where Star Trek Away Team was born.
So a really odd transition from a completely different game to Star Trek.
Yeah, and Zax did eventually get published after Star Trek Away Team. Internally, we called it Away Team or STAT. STAT was just the acronym. One of the conditions of Activision publishing Star Trek Away Team was that they had to halt development of Zax until the game was a certain amount complete. And when they hit the milestone, I think it was 3/4 the way to publication, they were allowed to start working on Zax again. And that's when I was hired. So at that point, they kind of branched off into 2 separate teams, and I was hired for the Zax team. But as a software developer with a code base that was heavily shared, a lot of the stuff that I worked on affected and benefited Star Trek Away Team. I did work on a few features for Away Team, but primarily most of the stuff that was developed, I developed for Zax, the other title. But I mentioned this earlier offline. I really was impressed with the technology that Reflexive's engineering team, which ironically included the CEO was a developer. So Lars Brubaker was the CEO and James Smith, the CTO, and they ran the ship as far as architecture and software development went. And they were very forward thinking and really had put a lot into how do you write software in a way that's supporting moving the code base forward and writing solid, working, functional, tested code.
And how many developers worked on the project in general?
I don't know if this is universal to the game industry, but when I was at Reflexive, we kind of looked at game development as a triangle. There are other disciplines involved, but for the most part, game development is a collaboration between software engineering, art, and level design. and we had a pretty even split between software engineers, level designers, and artists. I think while I was there, we had somewhere between 10 and 16, I'd say probably closer to 12, working on both titles simultaneously. John Price was brought in as the Star Trek subject matter expert. He, I believe, I don't know what his position was, but he was instrumental in Star Trek Academy, I believe, before he came to work for Reflexive.
So you got a good taste of Star Trek game development.
Yeah, I came in as a fan already, but he had some experience dealing with Activision and dealing with the process and how Activision does things. And I actually, coming from Loki, had worked on 2 Activision titles. I first was working on Heavy Gear 2, which is an Activision title. And then after we had published Call to Power, I was working on some modifications to get it to work on other platforms while I was still at Loki.
So if I understood that correctly, even though the origin of the game wasn't in the Star Trek universe, you guys still tried to make a game which really fitted into the universe?
I don't know if I was close enough to the design decisions to really have a flavor for that. I do know that there were a few places where there was some back and forth between what Reflexive did and what Activision wanted. I know there was a compromise that if you look carefully at the Star Trek Away Team, you'll notice all the characters, I believe, are right-handed, and that was a compromise on. I think all the Starfleet officers all use the same body. I'm not sure if they have. It might be by color. It might be like red for command, and I don't remember the colors offhand on it, but the bodies are actually shared.
So technically, it's the same model, just with a different head.
Primarily, yeah. I'm guessing there probably was a male and female, but yeah, same body. But the difference between the right-handed and left-handedness was to do with the space on the media, because we'd have to animate each of those separate. So even though the game looks very 3D, and there's 3D models for everything, not within the game assets, but in the original assets that things are built from. And basically those are rendered into a 4-dimensional character animation. So you had, an X and Y, and then you had several animations that character could perform, and then each of those could be performed from several angles. Actually, that's 5-dimensional. I forgot time.
Depends a little bit on the size of the team, how fast the progress can be, but how long did it take overall to produce this game? You said you came to the team a little bit later, but when did it actually start? Do you have an idea?
Oh, dates? I really don't know as far as the dates go. I'd like to help you out there, but I can't really say.
Just a rough number, 3 years ago or something like that.
I think I remember Zach's saying it had 2.5 years of development, and given what I know of the development history, I'd say that Star Trek Away Team probably was similar, and really that was a gift from Hasbro. I really think that a lot of startups end up in the situation where it's just patching the thing as it's going down the hill, and just trying to get it working in time to meet the deadlines. And because Reflexive had that extra cushion, they put a lot of proper engineering in, where I think a lot of other companies didn't have that luxury.
Yeah, I think this shows for a lot of games when you think, well, you could easily have put in at least 3 months or more into this and polished it a little bit more, especially the technical side. This is something I actually will never understand, why there are so many publishers that put pressure on the development teams and say, well, you have to get it out now, even knowing it actually isn't really finished. You can use it, you can work with it, but it has its quirks and players notice. And this, in my personal opinion, diminishes quality in a way that isn't good for the industry, not good for the team, and probably also not for the sales. So why not wait 2 months or something like that and do it properly? This I will never understand. They can tell me a lot, but I don't think that they will have that diminishing returns just because the game came out 2 months later. I don't think so.
Yeah, there is a lot of stories of, everybody has heard about crunch time and how that affects development. I will say that Reflexive was, being a game company, I was amazed that they had such a good grasp on work-home balance. I was a bit of a workaholic, but I was definitely the exception. Everybody put in their 8 hours and went home and had time, that they focused on, family and their stuff. And I think that made a lot more clear-headed decisions. The flip side of that being, I mentioned that things got decided at Reflexive and then got handed over to Activision, and Activision came back with their notes. And that led to a little bit of design by committee. And I do think some of the reasons why Star Trek Away Team didn't do as well as we had hoped was some of that. There was, I believe the game shipped with an easy and a medium level. And I believe the reason why there wasn't a hard, Activision didn't have the resources to properly test the hard level, so they didn't want to release it in the game.
So you actually created a third difficulty level, but it never got. It was not part of the release eventually.
Yeah, well, it was a matter of degree. It was a variation in like hit points and stuff like that. So it wasn't like there was a custom level that was built or anything like that. But game was hard enough to play through on the hard setting that Activision didn't feel it could adequately test it.
It's funny because I was always thinking about things like that. I mean, I'm not a game developer, so I have never seen this from the other side. But as a player, there are certain games where, if you push up the level just at the third or fourth level, and then it's already difficult to cope at all. And there are 3 more difficult settings, and you think, who in the world is testing that game? Who is having that skill? Who has the ability to actually cope with the situation the game developers created here? And somehow they seem to manage it. This is something I can't really imagine what's going on there. If there are, let's say, it's a kind of some pro gamers, or what exactly they are doing to test a game on the very hard setting when normal players simply can't cope with that.
Yeah, and I hear you, and I feel like there's probably exceptions to that. Like, when I was at Loki, there were all the games there. We were pretty much the ones that did the port and published the game. The one exception to that was Quake 3 Arena, which id had already done the port, and we were solely the publisher. And I mentioned id because Quake 3 Arena had, I remember, insane settings, and they did the development. And I think the people that we had involved wouldn't have cared as far as if the thing's impossible to pass. Also, I think they had like 5 levels, so it was a little bit of a different thing than, what if the insane level isn't playable? Well, okay, then
exactly.
play on an easier level.
I mean, there are a lot of games out there where for example, the AI simply cheats a lot more. And if you look at the numbers, you think, well, on a normal playing level field, you will not be able to compete with an opponent who has 3 times the resources of you yourself. If the AI doesn't play with certain mistakes or quirks that will make it lose, then you're done, because the AI will only roll over you. And somehow they still manage to test that. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure as far as how testing that went. I know Zax was actually published by a different company, Joe Wood, which I'm guessing you might be more familiar with than I am, because it was a European company.
It doesn't ring a bell.
They did change hands. They're no longer in business. Actually, somebody reached out to me about Zax recently, like in the last year, and I researched where is Joe Wood now, and they had been sold. I'm not entirely sure to who offhand, but I don't remember them being as involved as Activision was. Activision was a very hands-on publisher, and they did all their own testing. Activision did all the voice recording in LA, where by comparison, Joe Wood had us do all the sound recording for Zax on site. We did all the play testing for Zax that I remember, and all the localization. I think we had a third party do the translation. I was actually the one responsible for integrating the localization into the installer. I don't think I did that for Away Team, but I did do that for Zax and for Ricochet. But I was the translation guy there. Not that I translated anything, but I installed the translated assets into the titles.
We talked about testing, but of course, before testing, you need to write that software. And I know we talked before the interview here, but so I know the answer. But for the audience, what is the game written in? Are there any special frameworks? I mean, obviously you shared the engine with another game. What's the technical background?
The game was written in C++, Visual C++, for Windows. At one point, I actually had ported it to, not Star Trek Away Team. I had ported one of the other games out of that code base to Linux, but that was my own project on my own time, and it never went anywhere. But it was built on top of DirectX. It was a 2D game, so it didn't use any of the direct 3D stuff, but it was all frame buffer, DirectX. Again, you mentioned stuff we had talked about offline. They did a lot of hardware tricks with video page buffering, page flipping, so that you're writing to one page as you're viewing a second for smoother animation. Most of the API stuff they had isolated to what they called and what I've seen elsewhere called a hardware abstraction layer. So theoretically, they could port it to other platforms fairly easily. There was very little, if any, Windows-specific code in 90% of the code base. It was all in the HAL layer.
So essentially, one would have easily be able to do it for Linux or for Mac OS or something like that.
Yeah, so when I was at Loki, we had ported all of our games to a simple direct media layer, which was actually written by the CTO of Loki. And as an experiment, yes, I ported Ricochet, which was one of Reflexive's games, to use SDL also, and it was not very difficult. I think I spent maybe a month on it. But that was my own time, and that wasn't anything that ever shipped.
It's not really a big effort, and that's quite all right for a company. It should be easily doable.
Yeah, I would like to see the source for this release. I see that happening. Reflexive is now owned by Amazon, and Activision still owns half of that, and then Paramount owns part of it too, so I don't know.
It's probably not happening anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't think so. But we mentioned C++, and I mentioned too offline, they did some really amazing things with the C preprocessor, which is part of the C++ language, using that to develop their own reflection system, which is, I think you can find it somewhat in C++ now as part of Boost. Boost does some pretty weird things, but reflections definitely was not a thing in C++ at the time this was written. And they just were kind of miracle workers in how they engineered this, so that we had this whole tree of all of our objects we could serialize that knew how to write themselves to disk, read themselves from disk in the in-game editor, which unfortunately we never shipped. But there was some magical technology that they put into this. I'm really privileged to have had the opportunity to work with these guys. They're really genius.
It sounds really interesting to work there. Any special memories during that time?
Well, I keep saying that I was working on the other team, the Zach's team. One thing that occurred to me while we were talking is a feature that I do remember implementing just for Away Team. All of our, I forget the terminology. Either characters or entities had the ability to have AIs on them. And at one point, I think in the first level, which is in the demo, we're tossing a percussion grenade, and everything that affects how an object acts in our system was considered an AI. So one of the things I wrote was the gravity AI, so that when you bounce the concussion grenade, it would bounce off of the floor and into the place where you needed it to blow up.
This quadratic curve-like shape where you see it bumping, bump, until it stops.
Yeah, in the game we already had the ability to draw an object at an altitude, because that was just a variation in how the shadow was drawn. So it was just a matter of displaying it at a particular altitude in the game, so that we can have it bounce as it's supposed to as we're throwing it. Different than, say, how bullets behave. As far as special memories, I will say one thing that they did there that I really thought was great for team building, great for understanding where we were, for cohesion, was, and I don't remember how often it was, I want to say it was once a week. We spent an hour every morning, once a week in the morning, going from office to office, and each developer was able to show and tell what they had worked on the previous week. So, the art team gets to see what the developers and level designers are doing, and the level designers get to see, this is this thing that we needed. A lot of software development teams now use stand-ups. This is a very similar philosophy where each participant got to see what everybody else is doing. And if there was something that, hey, I know how to help this guy with that, or, oh, I need this thing and the thing that you're doing won't work with that because of this, it was a lot of cross-pollination that way. I really thought that made for a dynamic and really positive workplace. I think it was very supportive. Everybody there was always smiling. There was lots of sunlight in the office. We were on the bottom floor, but still, it was nice. It was back when everyone could afford every developer got their own window office.
Sounds really like an amazing work environment.
It was. I do believe I've heard after I left there, they did add cubicles. There was a section in the middle of the office where they could have put cubicles, but it was just really just a walking area when I was there. And since it was bought by Amazon, I know it was somewhere else in Irvine, but it was really a great place to work. And yeah, it was one of my more positive working experiences. And the people there were always positive, always great. It was very collaborative, and I'm, like I said before, I'm lucky to have worked there.
I can really see that. Sounds, like I said, very nice. I know you didn't work directly at the beginning with the team on that project, but do you know maybe what the original design was? In the sense, did they want to make a Commandos clone, or was it just something which developed during time to make something similar like Commandos?
Yeah, that I don't know. I think that kind of decision stuff was made long before I got there. I do know about what happened with Hasbro and how that led to the game, but as far as what style of game it was and how that all happened, I'm not really very aware of that. I do know, so Star Trek Away Team is one of 3 games that got published with what I'll call the full-blown Velocity engine, which is the engine that Reflexive built their games on. The first one was originally Zax, although Star Trek was published first. So Star Trek Away Team, Zax the Alien Hunter, and then Lionheart, Legend of the Crusader. And I remember when they were developing Lionheart, they were talking about this is going to be Fallout in a Renaissance era environment. So it was kind of like, I think dragons and stuff like that. I don't remember the details. But like you're talking about, Commandos, I'm not familiar with that title, but there was a lot of talk in the early part of Lionheart about making it a Fallout fantasy type game. And there was even at one point talk about putting it in the Fallout series. That didn't happen. We talked about Joe Wood going under. Interplay was a very big software publisher, including their Black Isle Studios. And in addition to Joe Wood, that's now out of business, the other 2 big games that were not self-published by Reflexive were Activision for Star Trek Away Team and Black Isle. I believe it has the distinction of being the last published Black Isle game before Interplay kind of collapsed on itself.
Just to mention it a little bit, or explain it a little bit better, Commandos was a game from, I think, 1998. It has a similar style of gameplay where you command just a few units. The difference is it's set in World War II, and you couldn't really select the units you want to take with you into the battle. But it was also very hard, especially, and challenging in that aspect that you only had 4 guys, and yeah, well, the Nazis had many.
There are definitely certain parallels. If you look it up at some point, look at a playthrough or something, you will see definitely that parallels between the 2 games. And when I first saw the game, it really struck me as, well, that looks like Commandos just in Star Trek. So this is where this question is coming from, because one might say, well, they just copycatted or something like that, and this is why it's important if this was a design decision right from the start, or if this was part of a process where someone thought, well, let's do it like that, let's do it in this fashion, and all of a sudden you have a game that behaves similarly.
I will say I was not privy to that. I would probably recommend asking Ian Hardy, who's the lead level designer, or John Price, who I mentioned as the Star Trek's game subject matter expert, about that, because I'm sure they were intimately involved in that type of discussion. But I'm glad you mentioned that, because actually it did remind me of, I mentioned some of the concerns that I thought of as kind of designed by committee that might have been why the game didn't do as well as it could have. I remember one of them was selection of your units and which ones were available. And the biggest thing was, I believe some points of the game, you need a certain unit, a certain character in order to do something to unlock the level to finish the game. And there was a big discussion about letting characters die. Is it possible to complete the game and even if a character dies? And the problem was, well, if you need this character later on, do we only fail if one of those characters dies, or can any character die? And how do we make that distinction? And I believe Activision came down and said, look, you can't win any level if any of the characters die. I think a lot of people felt that kind of shortchanged things. I haven't played the Star Trek Away team in a while, but Captain, you said that you went back and looked at it some, and how did you feel about the decision to not let any characters die be a mission failure? How did you feel that affected the game? And I remember at the time that was a big deal, and that was something there was a lot of discussion back and forth about.
Well, it's a tough one. If you look from the perspective of the 2000s, I would say it's a good decision. Now, I would very much like the option that a person can die and it affects the later game.
Yeah, some sort of penalty. I mean, there are a lot of games out there where your character somehow level up over the missions, and if you lose one, you don't necessarily have lost the entire mission, but it still has a major drawback because the guy you trained for, let's say, 5 missions or so, starts from 0 with a new guy, and, well, there's a penalty for that. I distinctly remember this was something that bugged me about Commandos. Probably what made it so hard, that you could not lose anyone.
Yeah, I think it was very much, you're familiar with the old, the interactive adventure games, where, you need to find the key to open the door to get to the dungeon, where this was a situation where the characters were the keys. So then how did you say, which characters do you still need, and if we're going to allow the character to die, do we have to have some other way of completing the mission? Or do we, and then there's the writing budget involved in how do you do that? And then, if we have that back door, does that defeat the purpose of having this other character that does this special thing?
Yeah, and there are other titles that do this just the very same way. I don't know if you know the title Hexplore, where you have your 4 characters and all of them have special abilities, and you won't get through any level without using all of their abilities. So losing one never is an option. But this comes kind of naturally to the situation. Especially in the Star Trek genre, it's very often played this way that, well, there's this character and nobody ever dies. Which today, of course, isn't exactly true, but back then, having a character really die didn't happen very often in the shows, especially if it was one of the main cast, of course. And I believe they played this card the same way in this game here. Losing one on an away mission isn't really thought of.
Yeah, and Tasha Yar obviously being the one big exception to that. But yeah, killing a character off is not done lightly. And I mean, this wasn't canon, but we were trying to be faithful to canon. I mean, it was within the canon of the universe, but I don't believe that the game itself is considered canon.
Captain, what do you say? I'm not sure. I'm not that cracky on that one.
If it's canon, no, I don't think it's canon. No, I really love it, but no, not this one. Sorry.
Yeah, what did you think about that holographic cloaking device thing that they had?
I think all of the items in the game are basically perfect for the Star Trek universe. They are fitting, especially things like, which I completely forgot, I had to rediscover that. If you choose certain characters for your away mission, you get sometimes different lines. For example, in the second mission, if you choose a drill, she will tell you, oh yeah, one of my previous hosts were on that planet. I did enjoy always the hunting here. Now I have to hunt Romulans. I like it. And she also comes with a transport buffer. And she basically tells you, well, if we kill some Romulans, we just make them disappear in the transporter buffer so they can't find the bodies.
What I find funny is that there are certain parallels to other games. And I mean, if you watch the intro of the game, then you will see a Starfleet starship which has the ability to make a holographic skin around itself and look like, for example, a Romulan warbird. And funny thing is, then a few years later, after the game was published, in Enterprise you have those episodes where the Romulans actually do have a ship that looks and behaves like other ships in order to cause conflict and stir up trouble. I mean, it's always interesting to see how certain concepts evolve independently but go into a similar direction.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of stuff that, generally isn't canon, but often inspires canon. I think the most famous Star Trek example of that is the name Tiberius for Kirk came from the animated series, which I've heard different people say whether or not that's canon, but it's definitely outside of what most people think of as Star Trek.
The funny thing is, if you consider the later shows like Discovery and you go into what is canon and what not, well, you begin to think that it doesn't really matter for certain individuals which decide which aspect of the show has to be developed and which has to go. And from that point, well, what is canon?
Yeah.
That's the most difficult question after 2009, I guess, after J.J. Abrams introduced those great movies.
Yeah.
But talking shortly about what came after the game, did you know that Star Trek Armada 2 and Starfleet Command 3 borrowed some elements of the game?
As much as I like playing video games, and I still do Quake 3 occasionally for an adrenaline hit, I haven't really been as active a gamer as I would like to be. It's kind of like too few hours in a day. So I actually haven't played Armada or what's the other one?
Starfleet Command 3.
Oh, yeah. You just jogged my memory. I don't remember if it was Starfleet Academy or Starfleet Command that John Price had worked on. He was the one that we brought in as a subject matter expert.
I guess he worked more on Starfleet Academy because that was 2 years before your game was released.
Okay, he was already there when I got there, of course. But I was unaware that anything from Away Team had been picked up. I do remember you'd sent me originally a list of questions that we'd be touching on. You had asked about a sequel, and actually a sequel had originally been greenlit until sales figures came back and Activision pulled the plug, and actually that resulted in a big layoff at Reflexive.
Okay, that's really a shame.
Yeah, it was, and I mean, they lost some great talent, but they also those who have still kept tabs on have gone to do some pretty awesome things. I believe one of the guys ended up at Oculus, but I don't remember the premise of the sequel. But there was some early development on the sequel before Activision decided that they didn't want to pursue it.
Like I said, that would be so amazing to have a sequel to that game, and maybe even a higher resolution. Do you know maybe why you choose 640 by 480?
I will say I don't recall if that was the only resolution for Away Team, because Zax had, I believe, 2 or 3 resolutions you could play on, and 640 by 480 was one of them. It might have gone up to 1024 by 768, but I don't remember offhand. But if I recall correctly, the reason for restricting the resolution, keep in mind that all the characters were fixed pixels by the time they were rendered in the gaming assets. There was actually a competitive concern that if the screen was bigger, that would mean that the characters are smaller and that more fits on the screen, and therefore the player can see more. That gives them a tactical advantage, and that was a concern.
It's pretty much the same thing with StarCraft. It's the same concern. If you have more overview over the map, then you have an advantage, of course.
Yeah.
But with StarCraft, I can understand that, because StarCraft is an RTS, a competitive RTS game, where this isn't.
When you look at certain Let's Plays, the first thing that comes to mind when you see this guy, why don't you scroll a little bit out? You can do it with the minus and the plus key, I believe. And if you know that, then you think, why not go a little bit more out? Or in general, why don't you look around? I've seen a Let's Play where the guy is going the mission in essence just from his current perspective. He doesn't take an overview of the map and look where he has to go and what is around him. He just looks at the current position. And in this game, of course, this makes also sense to have a bigger overview, to see more, to get an impression of what is going on around you. So it's pretty much the same idea, although it may not be as intensely competitive.
So I do think it was a tactical concern, but there was also the concern of, so as much as it tried to be, a real-time strategy game, I think that's how it was marketed. It was really a multi-character adventure game. Do you guys agree with me there?
Yeah.
Pretty much. Compared to Hexplorer, which is most definitely an adventure, and it's similar in certain aspects.
Right, and I mean, the point of an adventure game is it's telling a story, and if you already know all the secrets ahead of time, does that give you a tactical advantage that you wouldn't have had if you didn't know that ahead of time? And then how do you test that? How do I know, if I'm a playtester, how do I remember what I already know and what I haven't learned yet?
Yeah.
So I don't learn this into the next level, but I already know it because I've playtested it 5 or 10 times.
And I'm not quite sure, I don't remember anymore, if the game actually did have this fog of war mechanics, or if you could see the entire map right from the start.
You can see the entire map.
So you can look ahead a little.
Yeah.
I think I remember Zax having a fog of war, and I don't remember Star Trek Away Team. So I excuse me for not having a memory of that.
No, like I mentioned, it doesn't have a fog of war, and yeah, I can understand that that's a reason to choose that resolution, but as a gamer, I'm not a developer. As a gamer, it's odd to choose that resolution in 2001.
That's actually what I was wondering. Why exactly 640 by 480? Let's say 800 by 600, or one step more, 1024. It should have been doable, and not that I minded, but it seems a little bit off.
Well, I think there was a couple things. So Zax, which is where Star Trek Away Team came from, I believe it was intended. So, okay, even going before Zax, Swarm was basically asteroids. And I think the thinking in the company was build a better asteroids with modern technology. And, or not modern technology per se, but more modern animation techniques. How would you have done asteroids, 20 years later? Because I think, asteroids was, in the early 1980s. And I think the idea with Zax was similar in, this is not a side scroller, it's an isometric. But isometrics are primarily behind us. We're doing primarily 3D games. How would you do an isometric better today? I know there's a lot of detail and thought put into how do you make the animation smooth with regard to, I can almost give you as an example. I was looking at a tutorial a retro on YouTube the other day on one of the original Toy Story games. And they were talking about getting the crawling of the character in sync with the pixels that it moved. And I remember within Zax and Away Team and Lionheart, we actually baked the character's movement per pixel into the information we had about the character. So it wasn't possible. So the effect of not doing this is that when a character walks, it slides against the background. But we actually baked into the design of how we do characters that really wasn't possible. We know if we have the right character and he's set up properly, that he won't slide against the background because we've made that in sync with the background based on how many characters how many pixels he moves. So I think there was a lot of attention to detail that wouldn't have been done, when this type of game was designed. It was more, how do we do that?
It's kind of funny because
today what there was then. Go ahead.
It's kind of funny because if you consider modern games, there are a lot of games out there which still don't regard that, especially the 3D games where you walk around. If you look at the legs are moving at a different pace than the ground beneath them is sliding away. So I find it actually rather interesting that you kept that in mind and tried to do it the proper way. There are a lot of game development teams that obviously don't find that a priority.
Yeah, like I mentioned, I really thought that these were top tier engineers that really put a lot of thought into their work. We had talked about testing of the game. One thing that we talked offline before we started streaming was tough testing of the software, which for people that are not software developers, usually when you're talking about unit testing, what you're talking about is testing that the software functions the way the pieces of the software function the way you intend to write them, and that you haven't broken anything along the way.
Yeah, the integration test must also work well.
Right, and obviously not in the production builds, but in the debug builds of all the reflexive games, there was actually a test suite that ran at startup. It delayed the game maybe 3 to 5 seconds, that ran a test suite on not all the code, but some central parts of the code to make sure that it was all working the way that it was designed to work, so that we knew if somebody broke anything. And I think that was, very forward thinking. And these guys really had an eye for building things to last, building things in a way that gives them the robustness to be used in a lot of different environments. I mean, using basically the same engine to write Asteroids. Zax is a third-person shooter. We have multi-character adventure game, a Star Trek Away Team. We have Lionheart is a special system-based Fallout role-playing game. And then you have all of the self-published titles that they did. Ricochet is Breakout, basically, and then all the follow-on titles after that. That's a very robust code base to be able to, because as much as I wasn't primarily a Star Trek Away Team developer, a lot of the code that I worked on was in Star Trek Away Team because so much of the code was shared. You mentioned scrolling as we were talking about tactical advantage for screen resolution. And I actually introduced a bug to Away Team and Zax that I then later fixed that caused the screen to scroll all the time instead of just when you needed to get to the edge, which I later fixed, and that's fine. But I think it really speaks to the robustness of definitely Lars and James. Their forward thinkingness to make a code base that's so flexible to do all these different gameplay dynamics and do them well. I really was lucky working with them, and I learned a lot from them. So I'm lucky in that regard.
Most definitely.
I don't remember what the question was.
Well, the original question was basically the sequel, but I guess we can move on.
I do think there is some stuff to talk about the sequel. Unfortunately, I'm not privy to it. So I would say if you get a chance to talk to Ian Hardy or John Price or even James or Lars, that would be an interesting discussion I'd love to hear. But I really wasn't privy to the details of that.
No problem. As you mentioned the special word bug, what was during the development, for you at least, the most challenging aspect?
I know I tend to get caught up in details, so there was a lot of detail stuff where I made stuff harder for myself than I should have. That's just me personally. I will say one of the bugs that was most involved, I remember I mentioned that we had 4 different, I don't think I mentioned specifically, we had 4 different builds of the game. We had a debug and a production build of the editor and the retail game. So we had a bug, I don't remember what the bug was, but I remember I spent over a week on it, that disappeared in the debug build. So I had to troubleshoot it in... I had to troubleshoot it in the production build. I remember, I'm sure I wasn't the first one to coin this, but I remember at the time I coined it a Heisenbug after the Heisenberg principle.
That's a cool expression. Yeah. If every time you look at it, it's gone.
Yeah. But I remember I actually had to have a second computer set up in my office. Okay, so I think that the bug actually came down to the debug builds defaulted to running in a window and the production builds defaulted to running full screen. I don't remember what the bug was, but I remember it had something to do with that. And I couldn't really this is back in the days of single monitor machines. I couldn't exactly have the game running full screen and have the debugger running. So I actually connected over a network interface to the debugger running on my other machine that was running the game full screen in order to track it down. But I remember that was a challenging issue at the time.
I really like Heisenberg. I really like it.
Well, thank you.
There are a lot of bugs. I believe the worst ones are those where you think, I know yesterday there was a bug, I didn't solve it. Today I try it and it's gone. This cannot be because no one else was working on that stuff. Where did it go?
Yeah. It's also horrible when you're seeing the effect of something that's not in the program, but it's something that you're doing that's causing it.
Oh, yeah.
I actually was working totally different industry, software bug just recently. Some of the stuff was under test. It was sporadically tested. But one of the tests failed when we linked to a newly built binary compared to a historical binary that we had. So we thought we had lost the source code that differentiated the original binary, which was something like 6 months before it got checked into version control or whatever. And I actually spent over 2 weeks with a disassembler trying to figure out if this code was actually different. And it turned out to be that the system was linking against the wrong binary.
Yeah. It's like working on the wrong database and you think what's going on.
Oh, that was yeah.
But at least you find out. There are still certain situations where you think, well, I never really solved that, but I can't reproduce it anymore either. So
there's that too. Yeah, and I think that I guess I'm going to come back to a theme that we started was I think that's the value of having an automated test system that tests all your code. And I know Seven Saturn, you said you're a web developer and are a little bit more familiar with what I'm talking about here, but basically the value in having a system that says, okay, I haven't broken anything. That's, I believe, very valuable. And I realized what we did at Reflexive was, very early steps of that with Away Team. But I think that is something that imprinted on me that I've taken to other parts of my career. You mentioned, I already answered that part, but I'll let you ask the questions. But this is kind of a theme that I wanted to touch on in some of what you, Captain, had indicated that you wanted to ask me throughout this. I realize we're following the outline a little loosely.
That's quite all right.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Our questions are not in stone.
Yeah, as a personal plug for myself, if you guys don't mind, if I haven't totally scared you guys away, I am a software engineer with 20 years experience on the job market. If you are looking for someone with a game development background that's also got web development experience, I'm happy to talk to you guys and see if I can help.
Yeah, maybe not in the US, In Europe, it would be a long commuting trip.
But if anyone from our viewers, of course, hears that, well, we leave his contact details in the description.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. I very much appreciate that.
While we're at the subject about you, what was your favorite aspect of the game? We talked a lot about the problems. I'm sure you have some memories where you say, well, that was really nice.
I think I was slightly starstruck with, unfortunately, I didn't get to meet any of the talent, but I was a little starstruck working on a Star Trek title as a fan of the franchise. I mentioned to you guys that even though I'm not credited, I did get my voice recorded. It ended up not just in the game, but actually in the first level, which was in the demo. So a little bit of the actor in me got a rise from that. Like I said, it was a top-notch team. Everybody was positive. It was a beautiful office and a beautiful business park we were working in. And one of my best experiences as far as companies that I've worked for, they were always positive. It was always a fun place to come to work. Very different than what I've heard about a lot of these game companies. As much as they're positive places to work, everything kind of goes into nightmare mode in crunch time. I was a workaholic at the time, but at Reflexive, I was probably the only one. You guys want a funny story?
Sure.
So I was the workaholic. I was the one that was working at the office at odd hours for no reason except for I wanted to, put in 110%. One time I get there after hours and trip the alarm. And I call, either I think I had turned it off, called, so Ernie was the CFO, CTO was James, the head of the engineering, Lars, who was also a software engineer, was the CEO. I don't remember who I called, but I called whoever it was you're supposed to call when you set off the alarm. And I went back to my office and I'm working for, an hour or two, and maybe I called and I left a message or something. They were at dinner or something. I get a call back at my desk phone, and it's one of them telling me that the police are there trying to find out if there's anything wrong at the office. I was like, okay, I'll go out and try and rectify things. And so I go out. There was our office, and then there was a little lobby, and then outside of that was this sidewalk and a fountain. And I leave to meet the police, and I end up standing at gunpoint by this fountain at 10 o'clock at night, And I'm trying to explain to them, yeah, I'm the guy that set off the alarm, and I work here, and I'm sorry. But yeah, it was frightening, but in hindsight, it was kind of funny.
Yeah, I can imagine. If you're looking at the end of a barrel, it's not really fun at all. But when everything went well, okay, nice anecdote for the children.
That's definitely a nice anecdote.
Fortunately, no one was hurt or injured or anything. Yeah. But yeah, I mentioned to you guys offline that everybody there, aside maybe from me, had a really good work-life balance. I actually, as a hobby, do some theater, and shortly after joining Reflexive, I bought a house near Reflexive and was performing in a show at the local Sun and Sail Club, which actually I happen to live at now in our new house. And the theater company, Lars's wife, was actually choreographing the show that I was in after hours. So after I was done, writing games, I went down to the lake and we did. That was, I don't know, a month or two. We worked on that show, and it was a lot of fun. So, but everybody was family oriented. Wives and kids would be seen in the office, and everybody smiling, and really positive place to work. And
yeah, I wish there were more companies who understood the importance of that. I mean, especially your whole life is working on the project stuff. It doesn't really fly. After a while, you will burn out, or you will simply not be as effective and efficient on the job as you could have been if you had, let's say, a normal 8 hours job, and then go home, get your head clear, do a hobby like you said, and yeah, get your head clean.
Yeah,
this is important, I believe.
I agree with you. I'm starting to finally get that. I do think that from what I understand of companies in Europe, you guys seem to have your head on straight a little bit more than we do here. But then again, I know these are sweeping generalities, and I apologize. I don't mean to offend anyone, and I'm not targeting this at anyone in particular. But in contrast to the American work ethic and the European work ethic, as I understand it, you also have how things generally are done in Japan, where I think it's 10-hour days, 10 days a week is said tongue in cheek, but that's my understanding.
Well, Japan is actually a really good example. I mean, yeah, the Japanese are in a way workaholics, but as far as I know, they have the highest rate of suicide. So yeah, something's got to give. There's only so much a human can take, and especially in software development, it's not just technical stuff. There's always some kind of creative process involved. Sometimes, I mean, I have the best ideas when I'm going to the bathroom or eating or something, where your brain has nothing to do. This is where I got the best ideas, because the brain is free to roam around and to have new ideas. And you need room and time for exactly that.
Yeah, and I'm hoping I haven't offended a whole swath of your viewership, but yeah, I think Japan is, from everything I've gathered, an amazing place that I'd like to visit someday.
Yeah.
I personally don't want to work 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, but if that's what they like, I don't fault them at all.
It has kind of strange side effects. I mean, if you are sleeping in Germany in a cable car or in the bus, then people tend to look at you like, well, what's he doing? But in Japan, actually, people don't do this, because in Japan they have this mindset. Well, this guy is so exhausted from work, he needs a little rest, and this is looked on with a certain respect. So there's a different mindsetting that has certain side effects. Where you could say in Germany, no one would be comfortable to fall asleep in the bus. In Japan, it's not a big deal. There's also a positive side effect, but the basic aspect that it is generally accepted that someone works himself up to being exhausted, that's strange for me, because they know in the end, after a while, your personal performance will diminish.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and in general, I also agree. I do think personally, I won't say as a rule, but every now and then I feel like I invest so much of myself in something that I'm doing that every now and then maybe it's emotionally healthy for me to work an all-nighter, but on rare occasion.
Well, there are different situations. I mean, I get caught up in certain projects at a time just like that as well. If you're really into a situation and you really want to solve this problem, you know what to do, you just have to work it down, and after maybe 3 hours on top of your usual work time, you're done. This can be really refreshing and gratifying because, damn, you got it done, you know? This is quite alright. But especially in the gaming industry, as from what I've been told, is there are a lot of teams where 10 hours a day and 5 to 6 days a week at least is quite normal. And from my point of view, this is simply not normal. This is nuts.
Yeah, and expected whenever you're in crunch time, and crunch times can be extended from a month to 3 months to 9 months to 12 months.
And this is simply crazy. I mean, you can go like that for maybe 2 weeks and it's okay. After a month, you will feel certain effects. And after half a year, I bet you are burnt out.
I can imagine, okay, we're shipping in a month. We need a push to get the last bugs out. I can kind of see that.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I'm not saying that it is healthy to do in the last month, but I think we all agree that it's not healthy in any prolonged manner.
Very often it's not efficient either. If you're sleepy and you're trying to work on code, something's got to give. In this case, it might be the quality of the work. And then you invest even more time, which in the end you could as well have spent for something else instead of making mistakes.
Yeah, definitely.
Moving a little bit back to the game, I guess you didn't have that experience with Away Team, that you are nearly burned out at the release.
I did, like I said, I was a bit of a workaholic, and I did burn myself out a little, but I certainly wasn't burned out by the environment I was in. Like I said, Reflexive had a great work-life balance that we've already talked about. Heck, I even remember they did nickel and dime poker, I think, on Wednesday nights. And I'd even participate. Then everybody else would leave, and I would go back to my desk and work.
And would you say the team was initially very happy with the release, or were there a lot of unfinished features or stuff they would like to fix?
I do think that there were some frustrations on the things that I said that I felt were designed by committee. Like I mentioned, the ability for a character to die. But I think there was a little bit of frustration in that stuff. But I think everybody in general was very happy with the product we put out. I mentioned the level of detail, like when we were talking about, a foot slipping on the background behind. I think because of that level of detail, everybody was very excited and everybody was very invested in, thinking that this was a game that was going to do very well. And we were all very excited and a little bit crestfallen when sales numbers didn't quite reflect that.
Yeah, I can imagine it must be devastating reading the reviews and the press releases.
Especially when you're losing your job eventually. I mean, if there is no sequel and the company goes a little bit sideways this way, it's really hard, I believe.
I was actually a delayed part of that layoff. There was a pretty big layoff when the title originally was canceled, the sequel. But I was still working on Zax at the time, and after that, I went on to work on the in-game purchasing system, which was pretty innovative at the time, using a web server. And eventually, I got caught up in the aftermath of that layoff. But I can't stop saying enough good things about Reflexive. I don't know that much about what happened there after I left. I did catch up with a few people from there. I know it was sold to Amazon, and from what I understand, everybody seemed very happy about that, and obviously they cashed out. I don't know of anyone that was there when I was there that's still in, I believe it's Amazon Games now, or a division of, but that office has now moved somewhere in Irvine.
Going to the question, which is very important for me, is about the multiplayer, the co-op feature. Was that, always a core feature, or was it later added to the process, to the development process?
I think multiplayer in general, in both Zax and Away Team, was added mostly later. And if I recall, mostly the way it worked was all the game was actually running on main machine. I don't know if we called it a server, but it basically was a server. And all of our assets, I believe that we had it set up so that all the all the asset lists and all the clients needed to match. But I believe what we did was the main server would draw to the local game, and then it would draw locations and sprite numbers to a buffer that got sent over the network. So it was still drawing like every frame, except it was drawing it to the network. Not pixel data, but data from its repertoire of sprites and so forth. But I think in both instances, the Wait team and Zach's, the networking multiplayer part was added kind of later. I do remember that I think I was involved in actually the integration with the matchmaking, although that might have been more on the Zach side of things, but I think it was the GameSpy. So we used GameSpy for matchmaking, and I do remember integrating that into our system. I don't remember the details though.
Yeah, well, it's quite a long time.
Yeah, it's 20 years now.
Yeah, it had its birthday in March, I guess.
Yeah.
Wow.
Something similar we already asked another developer. You have been doing a lot of development stuff, not only gaming development. So I guess I altered the question a little bit. If you had to tell someone who thinks about going into programming, maybe especially gaming industry, if you had to tell them something, what would you tell them? A noob, so to say, which thinks, well, why don't I go coding professionally? What would you give him on his way?
That's a very interesting question. I think there are some lessons that I definitely wish I learned earlier. As far as the gaming side of the question, as you originally posted it, which may be a little less relevant to me specifically, but I think the takeaway that I have on that is just because there's a lot of studios that work people over hours, insane hours, writing a game doesn't have to be like that. I think that's one takeaway. As far as programming in general, I think some things I wish I learned sooner was writing software is not writing it so a computer can read it. It's writing it so other developers and yourself in the future can understand what's going on. And simpler is usually better than clever. And another thing I think is focus more on the process. It's more about dealing with people and prevent the problems instead of fixing them. I guess I'm talking a little bit in abstracts, but I mentioned the unit testing before. I think there's a lot of value in testing, a lot more than most people can appreciate, even those that have been doing it for 20 years. I'm finally realizing how important testing is to writing solid, maintainable systems. I will say I'm a little on the fence as far as what exact talents somebody that's not intrinsically a programmer needs to be good at programming. I think you guys have been following politics in the US, I'm sure, from afar. There's, I know Facebook put a big push into this initiative to get everybody coding.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea. I'm not saying it doesn't help. I think having those critical thinking skills, even if you're not a programmer, is important. But there may be parts of that I haven't really decided if they're learnable. It's some of that may be intrinsic, and I'm not really sure. I can't really speak to that.
Yeah, it's a certain mindset. I mean, there are people out there which are really nice artists. This is something which I sometimes lack. And there are people who are amazing when it comes to logic. You know, there's certain guys where you give them a problem, they think about it for 2 hours, and they come up with a solution where you think, oh gosh, how did he come up with that kind of on-the-spot idea? And we all differ in these aspects. Some people are really cut out for this work. I'm sure that there is this difference, and some really aren't. But as you said, at least it is important to get people to kind of being aware of certain aspects. I mean, one of the really funny things sometimes is when customers file in a bug report and they don't really describe what they are doing. They don't,
right.
or the other ways, they describe they have a problem, but they don't tell you how they think it is supposed to be. So now I know what's wrong, okay, but how do you want me to do it? And this has nothing to do with software development in general. Imagine you were going into a shop which sells you furniture, and you say, I need a chair. And that's it. You don't tell them if you need it for the office or eating potato chips in front of your TV. You just tell them, I want a chair. This is simply not enough. And there are many normal situations where you think, guy, use your mind for a moment. And especially when it comes to software, a lot of people are simply not aware of certain needs. They are not stupid, but they are simply not aware.
Yeah, definitely. I'm used to the term domain knowledge for that type of thing.
Exactly.
And it's amazing how much domain knowledge is taken for granted, even for somebody that's relatively new. It's when they're kind of in the trenches, they kind of are so used to something. It's people start assuming that everybody knows what I know.
And the other way around as well. Sometimes you think you don't need any specific knowledge to tell me what your problem actually is, what you want me that is happening. It isn't enough to tell me something is wrong. You also have to tell me what do you want. It's not always that obvious.
Right, definitely. Yeah, so as far as what I would tell somebody that wants to get into programming, I would say, first I would say focus on software engineering. Programming is a doing. It doesn't get you anywhere. You have, at the end of it, you have something you built that God help you if you want to fix it later. But I think software engineering is, focus on making it something that can last. Focus on writing software for other people to read, not for the computer to read. Clarity over cleverness. Simplicity as much as you can. Heck, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I still struggle with the simplicity thing. Oh, a little bit more specific to software testing. Saturn, have you heard at all of Robert Barton or Solid? You mentioned you're in development, so I'm tailoring this.
The name doesn't ring a bell, but maybe I know certain concepts.
Well, he's one of the Agile guys. And I really think that I don't think the importance of automated, quick, concise unit testing, especially unit testing that covers everything. I mean, unfortunately, it's a how do I get there from here problem. But I really think that's really important, actually, and that might bridge to one of the two remaining questions that you sent me.
Yeah, for the audience, next question is less on the technical side, but visioning, if money or resources were not a problem, what would be your dream project? What would you really want to do?
Well, not just because this is a gaming channel, but I gotta say, I love writing games. I'd love to go back into that. But as far as a dream project based on what I've done and what I'd like to do, I really see a lot of value in helping other software projects out by developing tools. Static analysis, for those that don't know, is instead of testing something by running it, it's kind of testing it by analyzing the code by looking at it. I'd really like to focus some on static analysis tools, especially Saturn. Any chance you can take a whack for the benefit of the audience and probably for Captain too? Can you maybe more concisely describe the halting problem than I probably can?
The halting problem.
Alan Turing's. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Never mind. I gotta admit, I never did studies on that subject, so I'm not originally a software developer, so I never went through the theoretical aspects of that. This is something I really want to catch up, and it's really interesting, but just as always, you don't have the time. It would be interesting to dig into this, but sometimes you really have to make the time for that.
Sure. So what I was saying was, Alan Turing, famous for breaking the Enigma machine in World War II.
Yeah.
One of the things he spent a lot of time doing was theoretical modeling and analysis of computers and what they can and can't do. The way the question was originally phrased is whether basically a piece of software that can analyze another piece of software and tell you whether or not definitively it will stop or run forever.
Oh, yeah. This I remember, yeah.
So that's a classical description of the halting problem. What that means to most people in layman's terms is you can't write a general tool to analyze arbitrary pieces of software and transform them into another language, or to analyze what it does, or
similarly to the Gödel theorem. If the system is complex enough, there are certain statements which you cannot falsify or verify.
Right.
You simply cannot.
Right. But there's a kind of a piece that Turing didn't mention, which was, no, you can't definitively write the tool that will do this in all cases, but you can lob off pieces of the problem. Yeah. And that's what static analysis tools do. I've seen various attempts by other people at doing this, and it might be a little bit quixotic for me to go after this, but I'd like to work on a tool that takes existing code and is able to transform that into unit tests So obviously, it would only work for ideally 80% of code out there, but
that would already be a lot,
Yeah, I'm the optimist. Probably 1% would be a big chunk, but I'll go for 80. But the idea being that if you could take a system and put 80% of it under test, and then if that 80% breaks or not, it allows you to build things with a lot more freedom when you're not worried about, did I break something?
And especially if you can do this test on a short notice.
Right. Well, I mean, that's kind of the thing about it being automated. The biggest problem with getting a software system under what us technical engineers call under test, where we can test the completion, the totality of the system. It's a how do I get there from here problem. Yes, we see the value. Yes, we want to do that, but we can't get there from here. How do we get there from here? And that's what I want to write, is how a tool to help people. I'm at 1% code coverage. How do I get to 60, 80% code coverage? And if I was there, what would that buy me? So I think if I had the resources, that's probably what I'd like to do.
One can only hope you will, because I would be interested in anything of that kind too. I'm speaking from painful experience here. If you lack anything of that, it's like walking barefoot on glass, broken glass. It's not really fun.
I only hope we're not alienating the hardcore gamer parts of the audience.
Oh no, they have to know. They have to be educated on the nitty-gritty stuff of development.
Yeah, this is actually something that doesn't just go for the gaming industry, but there it is just as spot on. If you know what big amount of work and knowledge and especially ingenuity goes into a, so to say, from a gamer's perspective, simple computer game. If you know the math behind that stuff, if you know the theory and the sheer amount of complexity, and sometimes it's really easy to forget that this is all in one game and you are just whining and complaining because the level just killed you once again. But then again, you can be happy that there's anything on your screen that is that amazing from a technical point of view. And I believe there are a lot of people who don't really appreciate that. So people gotta know.
I totally get that. I've actually been looking a lot lately at some YouTubers that are working on either retros on 6502 assembly machines or 6502 based machines. I know one guy's actually designed his own retro 8-bit computer that they're successfully marketing now. But and then somebody else is designing their own CPU for, the idea is designing it for the purpose of educating people. Yeah. But just looking at how limited these CPUs and systems were, back when this stuff was written, and realizing how much they did with so little. I mean, we're looking now at I've got
a modern computer,
4 gigahertz.
Yeah, the sheer complexity itself. There is no person on this planet who understands your computer that is standing next to your desk entirely. No one.
Yeah, I mean,
back then, a Commodore 64, you really could understand every piece of it, every pin of the chips you could really understand. Today, there is no one who really understands the entirety of your computer. No one.
Yeah, it's just mind-blowing. There were people that understood things at that depth, and there still are people that understand at that depth. Things have gotten so much deeper since then.
But always in their certain corner of the whole system. That's what I mean.
I was saying, harkening back to the Apple II.
Yeah, back then, yeah, exactly. There were guys, or today there are guys which really understand an entire system. But today there's no way for you, for a modern computer system or a piece of software like an operating system or an entire computer game. No way.
Yeah. Along the other question of what I do if resources allowed, I agree that it's not knowable. It's not knowable to understand everything in that depth. But I would like, and kudos to you. You've already created a successful YouTube channel. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but I'm interested in helping people not understand all of that detail, which we've agreed can't happen, but helping people understand the magnitude and complexity of it.
Yeah, exactly. If people were a little bit more aware of what actually went into one normal standard computer standing on your desk, that alone is mind-blowing for most people, I believe.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely had a great time chatting with you guys.
Yeah, we too. I especially learned a lot today.
I will say I kind of secretly hoped that this might be a reflexive reunion of sorts, but I'm happy to talk to you guys anyway. Like I said, the people I worked with there were really amazing guys, and at least one gal.
Yeah, I hope for the best in terms of that. It's always nice to catch up with people you are fond of.
Yeah, and I've run into a few here and there, but definitely was privileged to have worked with every single one of them, and I appreciate my time there, and I was lucky to have had that opportunity.
Well, and we have to say thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. It was, like I said, really eye-opening for me at least.
Well, I'm glad I could help. One thing that did come to mind, I think I mentioned beforehand, I realized, like we talked about, writing software is daunting, but I for one would definitely like to see new life breathed into Star Trek Away Team and these other games by if somebody is inspired enough to add this to maybe an open source engine that's out there. I think that would be great.
We would love that. I would also love that GOG would release the classic titles again. They are so lost in time, basically.
Yeah,
that is true. I really wish. I haven't seen this at all in video games, but I do know in enterprise critical software, very often clients will institute something called source code escrow, where if something happens to the original developer, the people that hold that source code in escrow will release it to the client that requested it. Obviously, that's a very different situation from mass market software that you're selling to thousands and millions of people. But I definitely would like to see, especially for these games that aren't really making anyone profit anymore. I'd love to see these released for a new generation to understand and learn from. I mean,
yeah,
I learned so much from definitely from working with these guys, but also from learning and looking at and understanding this code. I mentioned that they were doing reflections in C++ before anyone, I think, had dreamed of doing that kind of thing. If anyone from Activision or Paramount or Amazon or Joe Wood is listening and has a soft spot for the future generation of developers of video game titles, I really think that spearheading the ability to release source code to classic games that are no longer bringing value to the company that owns them would be a valuable contribution to society as a whole, I think.
I can only second that. I believe that the captain and I, we had this discussion also for the artwork aspect and stuff like that. It's a part of culture or cultural value that was created, be it a very technical one, but it is an achievement, so to say, and letting it waste in some sort of archive, what's the point? Especially if you're not making any money from it anymore anyways, so what's the point?
I will say, and this bodes poorly for this plea that we just made, I was very disappointed when I learned of, I forget the name of the thing, but somebody had built a interactive 3D model of USS Enterprise, and Paramount shut it down, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago.
Oh yeah, Stage 9, yeah.
Stage 9, yeah. I realized that, Paramount tightly controls their intellectual property, and I see value in that, and I mean, they're continuing to generate great value. I think we discussed offline that I'm really excited about the upcoming titles that are coming out. We talked about, I know I haven't kept up on Discovery and Picard and Lower Decks, but I'm very excited to hear what's going on there. I know Kate Mulgrew announced that she's going to be part of this Nickelodeon Star Trek spinoff that looks very exciting, that I'm eager to be able to introduce to my kids. Like I said, they're between 2 and 8, and I'm looking forward to them seeing the magic and possibility in Star Trek that I hope all of us see the value in. I think possibility and hope is really one of the things that I find the most valuable from the Star Trek franchise. And I don't know if you guys want to chime in on that.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Well, since this is going on a little bit longer than I expected, I would say we leave it at that. It's a good end. And yeah, thanks again for joining.
Thank you very much. I had fun, and I really appreciate the invite.
Well, maybe in the future we can hear each other again in the sequel of this video when more of the developer of Star Trek Away team are coming to this.
Oh, if you can organize a reunion, I'm there.
Okay, you will be the first I will invite.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, I would say this is it for this video. Leave us a comment, tell us what you think about the game, and of course, play the game. Until next time.
Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.